Hear me?
Yes.
Okay, we're there. Okay, welcome everybody to this session on Chinese language learning, and this is from a book, really a manuscript so far that I've submitted, called Millennial Expats in China. And most of the opinions that you're going to see are from the participants in my study. So today we're going to focus on language learning and journeys learning Mandarin. So please feel free to ask questions at any time. Everybody hear me? Can I get one yes?
Yes, I can
right.
hear you. Yeah.
All right. Today's topics will be basic precepts of Mandarin. We'll talk a little bit about what's easy and what's hard. Learning Chinese in the classroom. Is it worthwhile? Language progression after arriving in China. Then we'll talk about some of the pitfalls, and then provide some summary and conclusions. And I'm going to ask some people to read. I don't, for some reason, have access to seeing everybody's names. So if you would not mind reading, I would just appreciate just volunteering. So let's begin. Okay, let's look at some basic precepts of Mandarin. What's easy and what's challenging? And of course, challenging is a euphemism used by business people and academics for hard. Okay, so what's hard? First of all, what's easy is the word order. It's just like English, at least for English speakers. So you simply have subject, verb, object. So wo ai ni is I love you, and you just switch it around like Barney would and say ni I wo, right? So the word order is really not a problem, whereas in Japanese and Korean, you have to put the verb at the end and they say I, you, love, and so on and so forth. So with Chinese, no problem, mei wen ti, right? Another thing is that the pronoun system is really very simple. You only need to learn one set of pronouns. So the equivalent of I, you, he, she, and it is all you need to learn. So you don't have to change from a subject pronoun to an object pronoun, right? He likes me, not he likes I, right? So we have to be cognizant of those kinds of things in English. But in Chinese, it doesn't matter whether something is a subject or an object or a possessive. You just add a de, like will de becomes my, and reflexive. It's all pretty straightforward and pretty simple. Another great thing about Chinese is that you don't have verb endings. You have few tense markers. You have no person, number, tense, aspect, mode. So essentially, if you want to use the word go, most of your tense is going to be revealed to you by the adverbial beginning, like today. So today I go. Yesterday he go instead of yesterday he went, right? Notice that there's not even he goes. There's not even that final inflection to show something is third person. The verb stays the same. Tomorrow they go. You can use a marker to show will, but tomorrow they go. Now she go. I want he go. So you don't even have to worry about the Spanish subjunctive like quiero que se vaya, right? You have to change all of these things. So on the right, you'll see all the complications in Spanish, for example, and all of the things you need to know for one single verb. And in Chinese, one verb. Here's something a little more explicit just to show you just this one verb, shuo or shuohua, to speak requires all of these different conjugations and tenses and aspects and modes to be able to speak. But in Chinese, the one verb suffices. So try cool, refreshing Chinese. It's conjugation free. Okay, so if you're advertising for your Chinese program, you have my permission to use this advertisement. You might have to check with the Coca-Cola Corporation, however. What's more, no declensions, okay? But wait, what is a declension? Well, just to give you an idea, in German, declensions are these little things that come at the end of adjectives. And something like Latin, there are final endings that come after each noun, depending on whether it's a subject or an object, nominative, accusative, dative, genitive, and so on. And just in this simple English sentence, the tall man gave the short woman a red book on a cool Thursday. You have in German 8 choices that must be made based on whether something is masculine, feminine, neuter, nominative, dative, accusative, genitive, singular, plural, so on. I can tell you that when I took German, I either slurred it when I was speaking or I smudged it when I was taking a test. So there's a lot to understand. Just to show you the complexity of German compared to Chinese, here is a chart with all of the different possible adjective endings depending on where it's placed in a sentence. And as Mark Twain said, I would rather decline 2 drinks than 1 German adjective, okay? In Chinese, the word for red, all you need to know is that adjective and nothing else, okay? So try cool, refreshing Chinese. It's declension free. Okay. Also welcome to use this to advertise your Chinese courses. Next, but into each language, some rain must fall. So the question is, what's hard about Chinese? And as Ken said to Barbie, gosh, Barbie, Chinese is hard. Okay. So what's hard about Chinese? Well, there's a tonal system, there are characters, there are no cognates or borrowings, and there are different idioms, expressions, and origins. So let's talk a little bit about some of the difficult aspects of the Chinese language, or challenging aspects. First of all, there is a tonal system. I apologize to those of you who are already native speakers of Chinese, but for the general audience, in Chinese, there are 4 tones, actually 5 when you consider the neutral tone. And depending on the tone that you give, whether it's a high flat tone, a rising tone, a falling rising tone, or a falling tone, can give very distinct differences in meaning to words. So you really need to become aware of not just the word or the syllable, but the tone. So you have ma, 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 ma. Don't know how well I did on that, but as you're speaking, you need to remember each and every one of those syllables. However, you can be forgiven to some degree for not making them all, but there are, however, some tonal traps. So just as an example, you can see that these 2 sentences look very much alike, right? The only differences are a couple of tone markers, but these 2 sentences mean something very different. So the first one, by using in the word 熊猫, we're simply saying, I like pandas. However, by changing those 2 tones, we might mistakenly say, I like chest hair. So not all tones are quite as bad as this, but this is sort of a classic example of some of the tonal traps. What else is challenging? Characters. There are lots and lots of characters, and there's a method to some of the madness, but it's not one method. It's several methods that took place over thousands of years. The more you know, the more you can infer, the more you can understand. But the average Chinese person needs approximately 3,000 characters to be literate, and upwards of 7,000 to 10,000 to be more highly educated. So a lot of graduate students, professional people, are said to read about 7,000 to 10,000 Chinese characters. And like I said, there's a method to the madness once you get to a certain point, but that's not to negate the difficulty of being a first-year learner and trying to get your bearings down. What else is difficult? There are no cognates or borrowings. And I don't want to say that Spanish is an easy language, but there are a lot of freebies, right? There are things that we both take from Latin, things that you can figure out once you understand the system. We can see problema is problem, paraíso, paradise, any ED word, complicado, complicated, right? You can kind of figure a lot of these things out. The TION words are CION in Spanish, so nation becomes nación. and so on and so forth. So you get a lot of words that you don't even have to study that you can use in Spanish just by understanding that correlation. Japanese, even though we don't have the same roots, the Japanese have no compunction about borrowing words from English. So I just have a few examples. A lot of Western words are borrowed from the Japanese or by the Japanese. So words like beiju, beiji is beige, basu taminaru, bus terminal, masaji, massage, yero, yellow, question mark, right? Maza, mother, churipu, tulip, so on and so forth. In Chinese, however, there are only a few precious borrowings from English. So we can't really assume, oh, I know an English word. And so therefore I can turn this into Chinese. The only real word that sounds just like it does in English is the word pie, like apple pie, pingguo pie. Even a word like shafa. Anybody know what shafa means who isn't Chinese? Can you guess what that means?
Means a sofa.
Right. Okay. But I think you knew that, right? But it doesn't really sound that much like sofa, but that's where the origin is. So shafa. The next one, most people can probably guess, Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola. And of course, my favorite borrowing in all of Chinese is hormone, right? But looking as hard as I could with my assistants for several weeks, I think we found about 100, but most of them would not be necessarily intuitive. So you have, for example, motoche, motorcycle, but that second part is Chinese, right? From vehicle, so motor vehicle, and even motuo maybe doesn't sound that much like motor. So in Chinese, when you're learning a word, you are learning a word probably for the first time. You can't rely on a lot of borrowings. Next, different idioms, expressions, and origins. If I were to call you 250, what would that mean? Anybody? Okay, in Chinese, if I called you 250, I would be calling you an idiot. And there's a story that goes behind this where a king apparently lost an advisor and offered 1,000 pieces of gold to whomever would fess up to the murder. And it so happened that 4 people came to him and said, we murdered him, or I murdered him. And the king said, well, how can I determine this? And they said, well, since we can't determine it, why don't you divide the 1,000 pieces of gold 4 ways into 250? And he said, well, you're all idiots. You're all 250. And from that point on, the word arbaiwu, 250 means an idiot. Green hat, what does it mean? Why will you never see a Chinese person wearing a green hat? Anybody? I'm sure a lot of people know. At any rate, a green hat means you're cuckold. It means your wife is cheating on you. And again, there's a story where a woman was cheating on her husband. She made him a green hat so that she could see him coming home from over the hill so that she could shoo her lover out the back door. So wearing a green hat in China has certain implications. So if you're from Michigan State or from Wayne State, you may not want to bring your hat as a gift, baseball caps to Chinese people. Playing zither for a cow is like saying pearls before swine, doing something that cannot be appreciated, okay? Again, different origins. Just a couple of more idioms that Americans probably wouldn't figure out. Flower prince is a playboy. A little air ghost is a cheapskate, okay? A light bulb is a third wheel, which you can understand. If you're on a date with somebody and you don't want somebody to be hanging around, it's like they're the light bulb when you'd like to be in the dark, right? Letting my pigeon go means to ghost me, to stand me up. Has to do with homing pigeons, sending homing pigeons back and forth. And then suddenly someone doesn't send the homing pigeon back. It's letting my pigeon go. You stood me up, you ghosted me, etc. So a lot of these things, even when you learn the words, you may not necessarily understand the idioms, and these idioms go back 5,000 or more years sometimes. And many Chinese can't explain where they come from, but they immediately know what they are. Just like a lot of Americans understand idioms, never thought about them, never thought where they came from, but we inherently understand them. Okay, let's look at the participant demographics here. Who are these people? Who are the people that I interviewed for this study? Okay. Well, first of all, they're millennials, so they fall under a certain age group. So you'll notice so they're all between 25 and 40. 5 people were from 25 to 27, 7 were from 29 to 31, 5 were 33 to 36, and 3 were 37 to 41. So you see we have a pretty good distribution by age according to the demographic that I selected. In terms of race, we had 12 who were white, 2 who were Latino, 5 who were Black, and 1 who was Asian. So I think these demographics more or less fit, from what I can tell, the Americans, the North Americans that you are likely to find in China. Probably more white than others, but certainly there's a mixture. Additional demographics by gender, roughly I had twice as many men as women, which I've been trying to compile data, but it sounds like this is probably representative of what you will find in China, more men than women. By major, perhaps not surprisingly, the vast majority were humanities and social science majors. We only had a few people who were studying sciences, and even then, not necessarily the hard sciences like chemistry or biology or physics or any of the pre-med types. So we generally had people who had the type of degree that probably required an advanced degree before they went on, and many of them chose to go to China. Years in China, there was also a distribution here. 6 of the 20 were there for less than 2 years, so generally about 18 months. 10 of them were there between 4 and 6 years, and 4 between 7 and 11 years. And the self-reported Chinese ability maybe is not so reliable, because I think living in China makes a person a little bit more modest and humble. And so the self-reporting numbers probably don't necessarily accurately reflect where people were, but I think most people felt they were somewhat competent in the language. And then finally, I asked people to just rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of whether they were introverts or extrovert, because I felt I had a really good distribution of personalities. And again, you can see people found themselves across the spectrum. So I feel that my sample, I don't know if I can say sample, because this is a qualitative study, but I felt that the participants in the study were relatively as representative as I was going to get on a qualitative study. Okay, let's talk about learning Chinese in the classroom. Okay, how much learning actually goes on. A lot of you, I'm sure, are Chinese teachers, and you're wondering, gosh, am I getting through to them at all? Well, drum roll, please. Let's see what people had to say. All right, I'm going to ask a few people to read so that I can catch my breath. So I know Shinran is there. Would you mind reading the first one for me, please?
Yes. I studied 4 semesters of Chinese. Teacher taught more grammar and a little bit of reading and a little bit of writing, but not as much listening and speaking. So really, when I came here, I wasn't prepared to speak. And my listening was really, really poor. And the accent was a little different. It wasn't standard Mandarin in lots of cases. So that's how it went.
Okay, thanks. So what we'll see is there's a little bit of shock. So no matter what they learned in the classroom, there was still some shock. Can I get a volunteer to read for the next one? Can I ask Nina if you'd read this, because it has a little Chinese in it? Hello? Can I get a volunteer?
I can read again.
Okay, go ahead.
I had studied 4 years up to that point and definitely thought I could do more than I really could. And then you get out there on the street and you're trying to order something. You're like, God, what did you say? 不知道, I don't know. Just like 慢一点, a little slower. Just quickly learned that I didn't know as much as I thought I did.
Okay, thanks, Shinran. Next, another student said, it took me going and eventually living in China to really apply all the things I've learned. The conversation partners were good and all the exercises I would do in class. But once you leave that classroom, you leave that mindset. And it's easy to just put it to the back burner. You're still watching things in English. You're still writing in English. You're still talking to your friends in English. So when I did go to China, I swear, that's where all my language learning, like true language learning, actually began. Okay. So for those of you who are Chinese teachers, and I will probably say this again at the end, a lot of people credited getting a good foundation in the classroom. And all of that stuff was very much worthwhile. But until they had to apply it on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis, a lot of that stuff could get lost by the wayside. But when you constantly have to recall those words in order to hail a cab, in order to order food, in order to do basically anything, right? Go to the post office, ask for stamps, so on and so forth. You need to learn whatever Chinese you have and make it immediately available. And so everything you learn gets more and more reinforced, right? Okay, let's look at language progression after arriving China. And for most people, I think it was an up arrow. One student commented who'd been there, I think about 5 years and married a Chinese national. He said, the first year in China, my Chinese was pretty terrible. The second year, it was only a little terrible. The third year, it was reasonable. And the fourth year, it was getting pretty good. Okay, so we see this gradual persistence. Another person who was there, who went there cold turkey. When I say cold turkey, I mean, and I don't know where that expression comes from, had not studied any Chinese. He just went there, got a government scholarship because he'd gone to a pretty good university, and just took the plunge, right? Just jumped into the 10-foot deep level of the pool and decided that he was going to sink or swim. So his quote was, the first 6 months I was here, everything I heard in Chinese was just kind of like garbled nonsense. I couldn't parse any of it. And then after 6 months, I would start to be able to pick all of the bits and pieces of phrases and the phonetic structure and, you know, the pieces that people were saying. And so I started to be able to jump into it a little bit. Okay, so this is a person who had no Chinese, who started to study once he got there. And after about 6 months, he said, well, I started to feel, you know, I could jump into it. Another student who had studied Chinese for, I think, 3 years and had done quite well said, I felt so silly and so insecure those first few months that it was still a struggle. I didn't feel comfortable enough, but it was kind of a eureka moment when things finally came together. I know learning languages, you hit plateaus and then it kind of feels exponential. And I feel like that came about 3 months in, and then I started going out a lot more, just talking to random people in the cafeteria, whether they wanted to or not. Okay. And then another person who also went to China without having studied the language pointed out in year 2, he said, you start to absorb the vocabulary. Then you start to learn slang and you start to learn the different ways that people talk about things. And I'm not a studious learner, but living here, there are tons of opportunities to learn it. And I chose a picture of SpongeBob, of course, because learning can be like being a sponge, right? This quote came from a student who was, I believe, in Shanghai, and I believe spent 5 years and did a graduate course in Chinese philosophy. So Shimran, can I ask you to save my voice and read this for me, please?
Yep. I was always playing catch up, especially when I went back to get my master's degree. And even though I went through a year of intensive language study, I was still doing catch up. I was still learning more words, going to lectures, writing down as many notes as I could. going back to my room, translating as much as I could, just to go to another class and start the process all over again.
Okay. Can anybody relate to that learning English? Did you ever feel like you had to just continually play catch up, look up new words, things like that? So obviously when you're studying Chinese philosophy, there's a lot to it, and I can only imagine that type of struggle. But
Well, I feel like I'm still doing the same thing now, unfortunately, but
I admit to looking up words in English every day as well. So which takes us to a very relevant comment. The next one. This again was a participant who'd been there for 8 years. He said, by year 2, year 3, I had a decent enough Chinese level where I could start to communicate with some basic stuff. Then obviously by year 5, it was pretty easy for me to make people think that I spoke like perfect Chinese. And that was entertaining. But yeah, it's never stopped. So yes, Shinren, for you and for me, whether it's our native language or a foreign language, it never ends. It never stops.
yeah, and I think another thing is every year there are new words and new phrases coming out. So even for a Chinese, I have to keep up with, the younger generation just to try to understand what they're trying to say. So just like we
Right.
said, it is a lifelong learning thing.
And such is the nature of language. It's dynamic. It's ever changing, right?
Yeah.
All right. And finally, there was a student who really wasn't progressing in terms of language because he was living in Wuhan, in a relatively big city, and he was surrounded by plenty of people who spoke English, whether they were American, European, or Chinese. But then he suddenly moved to a Hefei, which is an Anhui, which is a little bit less populous in terms of its foreign population. So his quote was, after 4 years, after 4 years, I moved to Hefei, and then I didn't really have anyone. I was on my own because I started a new job, and my listening improved by leaps and bounds because I was forced to listen. And I'd say the listening got better than my speaking. And so just talking with friends, having friends there, and being a teacher helps, because the high school kids, most of them were happy to teach me Chinese. Tell me, what does this mean? What does that mean? And then my colleagues will teach me things, cultural references like, and I can speak to having been a lone foreigner in Japan and being forced to speak Japanese for absolutely everything I had to do in the course of a day or week. So your language will definitely improve when your survival depends on it. Okay, pitfalls. What were some of the reasons that some people did not progress as much as others? And what it amounted to especially were a dependency on others, overly accessible English, self-discipline, all or nothing proposition, self-confidence, and a frustration with local dialects, although most people said that was negligible because generally most people could speak Mandarin or would communicate in standard Mandarin, especially with foreigners. Not always, but can I get a volunteer? Would somebody care to just read this one? It's
I'll
dependency on
read it.
others. Okay,
I can read it, John.
please. Yes.
When I moved to China, I moved with somebody who spoke the language well enough that I didn't have to immediately pick up on it. So I found myself really handicapped by that. It's also unfair because I already speak English and I speak Spanish. So I handicapped myself by telling myself that I didn't need a third language, and also by letting other people take the lead on translating.
Okay. So, sometimes you have a guide and, well, why should I bother to learn the language? Because I have, someone to do this for me. People tend to take the path of least resistance. Thank you, Dave, for reading. Can I get another volunteer? Dave, do you want to continue?
Sure. Dependency on others. I got by with basic Chinese, and then the things that were complicated, like, say, getting an apartment or something, I had help with from people who did speak excellent Chinese. And unfortunately, I didn't absolutely need it. which was good because on the one hand, I got going much faster, but on the other hand, it would have forced me to really learn it so well.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. So obviously, necessity is the mother of invention, but I suppose it's also the catalyst for learning language as well. Continuing on, one of the other concerns was that English was just too accessible, and so why not go to English? Why struggle reading the Chinese sign when there's English, or why struggle making yourself understood in Chinese when people are happy to speak English? So one of the participants I had said, it might just be that curse of being an English speaker in China, where you're living on a campus and most people want to practice their English rather than talk to you in Chinese. And likewise, one of the participants that I had who had been involved in a number of cultural exchanges and met people here and there. And by the way, I like the idea of the cultural exchange. It's worked out well for me. And I've met people in Spain and so on that I keep in touch with to this day, but very often it's very inorganic. People are coming together just because they want to learn the language and they may have very little in common. So some of the introductions tend to fizzle, as you can imagine. But this one particular student said, to be honest with you, they learned a lot more English off of me than I learned Chinese off of them. But we did have those experiences of sharing language and interchange. Okay. Some people I've talked to outside of this study say, if you really want to learn Chinese, you need to be selfish. You need to find people who don't want to learn English, who will speak with you in Chinese all the time. And one individual I'm thinking of went to a cooking school where he said nobody wanted to learn English, and they would speak to you exclusively in Chinese. And so you were going to sink or swim. You were going to learn that language. All right, another pitfall is self-discipline, right? They have a saying in Chinese. It translates 3 days fishing, 2 days drying the nets. And in English, we use doing something in fits and starts. You'll do something for a while and then you will leave it alone, okay? And this tended to be common among many Chinese learners. So can I get a volunteer for the next reading? Yeah.
I can do that.
Okay, please.
Self-discipline. It was unstable at best. I would go from feeling really motivated for a couple of days to feeling like I didn't need it, to feeling motivated to feeling like I didn't need it.
Okay. So I think this was not terribly uncommon for a lot of the learners. I mean, even the more ambitious language learners, I think, need a break. I know, for example, that when I was in Japan, I needed to get away on the weekend and hang out with my friend from Australia, or my uncle who was living in Tokyo, and like, oh, I can express myself fully, completely in English. And then I would go back to the grind of speaking nothing but Japanese for 5 days. I don't know if it's, I don't know how many people can just pick up a language and just go, because it's like starting an exercise program. And if you're really out of shape, you're not going to start an exercise program like Rocky and Rocky 4 or something like that, right? You need to ease your way into something and develop an endurance and develop an ability. And of course, there's a lot of frustration. And just like with diets and exercise, people just go off the diet. So I think language learning and diet and exercise are very similar in terms of a lot of initial enthusiasm, a lot of quick fizzling, sometimes returning, sometimes going away from it. This I thought was interesting, an all or nothing proposition. My gosh, this is too difficult, so forget it. So Professor Liang, would you mind reading once again?
Yes. When I was immersed in it, I feel like it's almost too much. There's nothing that I can do. And so why even try? So I didn't. No formal classes, no tutoring, nothing. I just would ask little questions to the people around me that spoke it.
Okay. So it's very easy to just say, oh, this is way too overwhelming. I'm never going to get there. So why even try, right? And of course, there's a Chinese proverb for everything, right? So I had to find one, and that is, as everyone knows, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, which is, of course, attributed to Lao Tzu, right? So whenever things seem so formidable, always remember that. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Self-discipline. This is similar to what we'd heard before. Can I get another reader and volunteer?
I'll do it.
Okay.
Self-discipline. Very chopped up. You could say haphazard, scattered. But I ended up getting a Chinese government scholarship and doing a master's at a Chinese university. It was an English program, or a program in English, I should say, through the philosophy department. But just generally, my language learning experience has been very haphazard, not very, I guess, diligent.
Okay. So look at the great pictures I came up with. Chopped up, right? Haphazard. Everything's strewn about. I study, but then I give it up, then I come back. So everything comes back to that 3 days fishing, 2 days drawing the net, right? Another quote that I had from someone, I think there's some people can be a little self-defeating, or they feel that there's a self-confidence problem. Most studies tell you that people are inherently capable of learning a language. It doesn't even have to do with IQ or intelligence. You can take someone of subnormal intelligence and you put them in an environment, and eventually they will pick up that language. People who've been imprisoned in different countries where they didn't speak the language come out 10 or 15 years later as fluent as anybody. But one of the participants to me said, I make efforts in my day-to-day. When I'm out and about, I can tell people where I want to go. I can tell a taxi driver, I want to go here, make a left, make a right. And I can have very, very basic conversations. I talk with my boyfriend's mother, who only speaks Chinese. I can say a few things, and she's very, very sweet. She'll try to say a few English things. I've tried learning through books. I've tried learning through apps. I've tried learning through one of my jobs. They offered a free Chinese lesson through one of their Chinese teachers. I just can't. It doesn't stick. I've tried and tried and tried, and I literally, my boyfriend will sit there and be, okay, this is how you say this. And then the next day it's gone. I don't remember. I just don't have the brain for learning languages. Okay. One thing I would caution is, if you have a spouse or a significant other, do not think that you can teach them or that they can teach you anything. Okay. So if you're going to learn a language or learn anything, my recommendation is that you find somebody on the outside. I think you need at least a tiny bit of hierarchy to get through learning anything. Just my personal observation. Frustration with dialects. I'm going to call on Professor Liang to read this, if you will, and tell me that doesn't look like most of the taxi drivers that you see in China. Professor Liang?
I think you just scared her away.
I scared her away. Okay, Shinran, do you want to read this for me?
Yeah, frustration with dialects. Sometimes they can speak really fast, but I can still figure it out. I think the only time I really hear Wuhanese is actually when I'm in a taxi drivers. Yeah, they speak a lot of Wuhanese. Even my co-workers, they all speak just like regular Mandarin, you know? But but when they say, what do you want to eat? Or where are you going? Or what are you doing? Like, 干么事? Okay. Now I understand. Yeah. Now I understand why you want Professor Liang to read it. You know, and lots of foreigners talk about this all the time too in Wuhan. And I also learn from them, their experience. And what do they hear and what do they know? Yeah, it helps.
Okay. And by the way, the taxi drivers are probably the best language teachers that there are, especially in Beijing. They're very patient and they've had to deal with foreigners. And so they're able to repeat in their heads whatever the foreigner said and figure out what the tones should have been and communicate. I can remember trying to tell a taxi driver that I needed to go to the police station, and I didn't know how to say police, and so I said in Chinese, if a bad person does a bad thing, who comes? And I asked him that in Chinese, and immediately he knew, 派出所, 派出所. So he took me to the police station. But the taxi drivers are great, and like I say, especially in Beijing, because they see the most international people around. All right, let's continue. Some conclusions. Okay, so just to sum up what we've talked about, classroom learning provides a helpful foundation, but living in China and using Mandarin on a daily basis is essential for mastering the language. I think it really is indispensable. I've seen some people who have a Chinese spouse and maybe they're able to converse almost constantly in Chinese. And so that also helps. But generally, living in China, there's almost no substitute for it. Like I say, you're constantly called on to use everything you've ever learned to defend yourself. And so it's not just learning something for an exam. It is learning something for yourself, and it's constant reinforcement. And so you never forget those things that you have to use on a daily basis. Next, long-term sojourners reported improvement year by year. So as long as you stay in the game, as long as you are persistent, you will prevail. As a first respondent said, he went from pretty terrible to a little terrible to reasonable to pretty good. And as Shinren would agree, the process never stops, right? We continue to learn language forever and ever, whether it's our native language or whether it's an acquired second or third language. There were Eureka moments that people reported, but again, improvement had no end. So there may be more than one Eureka moment, right? There's, of course, the main one where you said, oh my gosh, I'm speaking this language. And then there might be a time after that you feel like, oh my gosh, I can't speak this language at all. And then you'll have a resurgence and feel that you can speak fairly well. But it gets better and better and better. But there really is no end, especially I think Professor Liang will agree with idioms and some of the cultural and historical references that take place. Yeah, I can speak Spanish really well, but if someone speaks about children's shows in Argentina in the 1980s, I have no frame of reference and I cannot join that conversation and will probably understand very little of it. Pitfalls amounted to, just to reiterate, dependency on others, overly accessible English, self-discipline or lack thereof, all or nothing proposition. Oh my gosh, this is too hard. I can't do it. Either I know it perfectly or I don't. Okay, you have to understand it's going to happen little by little, just like weight loss, just like exercise, just like many things. Self-confidence. Some people just tell themselves they can't do it. They can't do it. And on occasion, there was some frustration with local dialects, but that seemed to be more or less negligible. That didn't seem to be the major impediment for anyone not learning Chinese. Yo Wentima, any questions? I cannot, for some reason, hello. I cannot see everybody on my